I like this table better.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Portsmouth Planning Board Work Session, May 5th, 2022. We have several members who weren't able to make it this evening. Mr. Simonis, would you sit for Mr. Mahana?
Yes.
And I think otherwise we have 6 of us, including Mr. Simonis.
There's no voting, so.
I know, just in case, just in case. At least we have more than a quorum, so. We're here to talk about and listen, I guess we're here to listen and then get a discussion with staff about the zoning amendments. And first we're going to receive and discuss the Land Use Committee Existing Conditions and Strategy Report.
Yes,
Sorry.
That's okay.
he's struggling with the thing.
I'll hold off.
And so, Steph, if you could pull up the presentation. So, good evening, Mr. Chair and Planning Board members. You have in your packet that was sent to you this week, and it was sent to you prior to this as well, a sort of summary existing conditions and strategy report that went to City Council and also was developed by the Land Use Committee, sent to City Council for approval and review, and now it's before you. Part of it is spirited by some of the requests that this board asked for information, and so we tried to compile it. I wish that we were able to do a multi-year deep dive in a lot of the data. We spent quite a bit of time presenting what we have before you tonight. And then if you look in your existing conditions and strategy report, there's a little bit of extra data, and there's a couple of extra tables that might be of interest to you, but I'll try and summarize that in this presentation. I'd like to just go ahead and jump right into that, if that's okay.
Please.
So I thought I would take a look at where we are in population. This is something that is of interest to me, as I lived here once before, and I was surprised to find that population has not risen exponentially like I've seen in so many other places, but it has risen, and you can see that we have added, since 2000, we've added 1,422 residents. The source of this was the census.gov quick facts, but I also pulled this data from the Office of Strategic Initiatives, the data files at the data center. So I corroborated the information between the two. I think actually the quick facts are the source for even the OSI. So we, of course, you can see in 2020 we had 20,784 residents, and then in 2019, 2,206 residents. We are averaging adding 71 residents per year. The HUD places our persons per household count for the city of Portsmouth at 2.07, which would account for 34 new households per year. And I recognize that's a little jarring when we understand a lot of the development that's occurring, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward.
Question now, or just on the?
How long would you estimate your presentation?
My section is actually pretty quick. I only have, I think, 5 slides, so I'd be glad to answer a question if he has one.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious on the population. You're right, it didn't move a lot, but I was wondering, is it stable, like everyone is here, has been here, or do you notice like 500 people leaving, 500 people, 1,000 coming in, and 1,000 leaving, or?
I don't actually have migration data on that, but what we did try to dig a little deeper about the nature of those residents. We did ask the assessor to take a look at who has New Hampshire listed as their primary mailing address, and then those that aren't in Portsmouth as their primary mailing address. And I think that we calculated potentially as high as 10% of the population has their primary mailing address in another state. Including Maine and Massachusetts, were pretty high up there. So it does sort of corroborate an idea that we are becoming maybe a second residence community. I think anecdotally that's been pointed out to me by many members of the community, but certainly our first look at the data suggests that that is probably true. Okay. So this was interesting to me, because I sort of pounded my head when I saw these numbers. I said, this community is growing very slowly in terms of adding residents, but we know that we're adding development rather quickly, and I'll talk a little bit about that addition. Yes?
Yeah, one caveat to that, I think, maybe, Jim, is the renter population that is generally nationally slower to change their residency and their primary address. So if you look at like a West End Yards development, how many of those new 300 to 400 residents have switched their residency to that address yet? I'm sure a good handful of them have, but I'm sure an overwhelming majority have not yet, just because it does take a while and some people don't know if they're going to be here for more than a year.
Okay.
We should have better data, I think, when the 2020 census data comes out for our jurisdiction.
Okay, sure, thank you.
I'd like to continue. This data comes from the Office of Policy Development and Research. It is the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data. It is I think the bar that we're measured by. It's important to note that this CHAS, otherwise known as CHAS data, is a 5-year average. It's put out by the census, and it's a deeper dive into census data. It's a 5-year average released on a 3-year lag annually. So if you wrap your head around that, but it is the data by which we're measured, not only by the federal government, but also all our CDBG funding, and as well as the state. Our own state will be looking at this data. So it's important to kind of get our heads around it. A household is said to be cost burden when it pays more than 30% of its income toward housing expenses. At a more extreme measure, a household is said to be severely cost burden when it pays 50% of its income toward housing expenses. As noted in the charts above, 12% of the residents are paying 50% or more of their income for housing costs. The most heavily cost-burdened members of the community are renters. 36% of renters pay more than 30% of their total income for housing, compared to 23% homeowners. While the number of cost-burdened homeowners has gone down over the past 8 years, 22 to 14, so that's an unusual thing to see, the number of cost-burdened renters has remained steady at about 21%. So a significant portion of our community is cost burden. Overall, the total for Portsmouth, the next slide, please. Nearly 1/3 of Portsmouth residents are cost burdened, 12% are severely cost burdened, and 17.7% are just cost burdened, meaning they're paying 30% or more for their housing related costs. And that, again, the source is listed there. Stephanie, if you could continue. Nick did a deep dive into our current assessment data, which was no small task. I think this took him hours. The coding can be rather complex, and the sorting is a complex exercise as well. But this really gives us a great where we are right now in terms of our housing typologies in our community, what we're comprised of. Single-family residents and condos still comprise 60% of all housing stock in Portsmouth. Multifamily units, which are defined as 3 units or more, and mixed use comprise 30% of all housing in Portsmouth. And since the adoption of the accessory dwelling unit ordinance in 2017, the city has approved 32 ADUs. Many have come before this board recently. We've had quite a few, and we got more coming. And 40% of all ADUs were either attached, and 41% were garden cottages. So, that seems consistent with what we've seen. We don't see a lot of detached, but we're starting to. Trends, recently approved projects. From 2015 to 2022, 28% of all approved housing units were multifamily with greater than 100 units. 29% were multifamily with 50 to 100 units, and 28% were multifamily with 25 to 50 units. And this is also in your strategy report. Location of the housing units, 85% of all new approved housing are located in the city's urban zoning districts where infrastructure and utilities exist. 40% of the new approved housing units were located along commercial corridors in the gateway zoning districts, and the downtown accounted for just over 25%. West End included 20% of the approved new units. And only 3% of all housing units were located in traditional neighborhoods. And I will pass it to Councilor Moreau to talk a little bit about the regulatory work plan, of which is the subject of this work session this evening, and talk a little bit about process.
Yes, so the Land Use Committee has taken at the very beginning of your existing conditions plan, it gives you a sort of a summary through the introduction and local planning context of the housing policy. So we looked at the master plan, the city council recently adopted goals for the citywide, and then the housing policy that was adopted originally back in 2016. and pulled from it all of the pertinent parts that I think will direct all of the review of all the zoning changes that we have. So that then got us to work out a beginning phase one of things to look at. Phase one, which you got a brief overview of that at our last city council meeting from our Nick Cracknell, who gave us a great overview of that. And then phase two is going to be looking more at ADUs and looking at our assisted living facilities. One of the things we want to do as we get to phase two and phase three is land use committee is going to start to organize some stakeholder meetings. So one of the things that I certainly hope you guys will give us feedback on as well is the stakeholder lists, as far as who we think should be part of these stakeholder meetings, where we get some feedback and ask some questions about what they think about specific zoning areas. So it would be really helpful to get that feedback from you all as far as what you think. We've listed here, obviously we didn't list any stakeholders for the phase one, that's really more of a code cleanup, but phase two and phase three, we have begun to put together some very detailed lists of who the stakeholders would be. We've also looked at the different housing types that will be impacted, the objectives of each code change. We've also been requested to look at some other different types of code that we haven't quite fit into the schedule yet, but that is the overview of taking the goals of the city through our policy and turning it into being able to look at for the longer term and on the bigger picture all of the, and our land use committee flow chart. Sorry, I don't know what the slides are, so.
That's okay, neither do I.
Sorry, that's I was supposed to print those, and I let her.
It's all right. This flow chart was based off of a request from a member of the public at one of our meetings, as far as the flow of how all of the zoning should go, and where sort of the city council initiated that the land use take a look at the policy and set up what we're going to look at from both the policy side and the zoning regulatory side. And then that is going to then, land use talks about that and has public input on it. It then goes back to the city council, where they refer it to the planning board to review, as we are doing now, and then to have public hearings. And then that we refer what we've then, put together as what we feel is the best changes forward, goes back to city council, where there's another public hearing at second reading. They'll have first reading, second reading, public hearing, and then third reading before any changes actually get adopted. So that's just a quick flow chart showing how that all goes.
And this is Nick.
So there's four public hearings.
Well, there's public input at land use committee, there's a public hearing at planning board, and there's a public hearing at city council. So technically 3.
So the readings,
Two
the
public
readings
hearings
at council, only one hearing, and the others are just,
Well, there's 2 public hearings, and one's just input that we get from the public at the beginning. That makes
Okay.
sense. There will also be the stakeholder meetings, but.
right, those are just
that-
public meetings, right.
Right.
And just one other thing, will you circulate this presentation as well?
Absolutely. And I think we'll be uploading it, and we'll send a link out, because
Okay, great.
yeah,
I think that would be helpful.
It would be helpful also for all other members
of course.
that aren't able to make it tonight.
Does anyone have any questions about what I talked about? Nick, I think you're
All
on the
right.
floor.
Thanks, Beth, Rick, and the rest of the planning board. So is it just the arrows? Yep. Down or?
Side to side.
All right. So again, like last week, Nick Cracknell, the principal planner in the planning department. I am going to try tonight to get through this very quickly, the first round, understanding some of it's really tricky, and there'll be probably a lot of questions from some of you as to what we're actually trying to achieve and whether we've hit the mark. Even since last week, we've made many little tweaks and revisions to the text in order to try and hit that mark. So by all means, I think the purpose of the work session here is to start the conversation with the planning board and the larger public and make sure we get these right before we have the public hearing at the city council, and ultimately, hopefully, adopt and address some of the zoning issues we're trying to get to with these Phase 1 amendments. So the focus of the Phase 1 amendments are really on building height standards. There are a couple of other little pieces here relating to civic properties and municipal properties, but it's really a focus on building height and providing consistency across all the character districts that we have in the downtown and the West End. We've had this zoning in place since 2013 in the downtown, 2014 in the North End, and 2015 in the West End. We have a couple of incorrect references in the code we'd like to clean up as part of the Phase 1 amendments and really try and get to clarifying the intentions of, I think, not only the City Council that adopted the character-based zoning, but the citizenry that has engaged the Planning Board, in particular when you're reviewing a lot of these large projects that come through the character-based zoning in respect to how building height is even calculated. So there's 4 main changes that are in this Phase 1 set. The first ones relate to the building height map itself. And 3 things that we're trying to achieve with the building height map is to assign building heights to civic and municipal properties. Right now, municipal and civic properties in the character districts have no assigned building height to them. Not a min, not a max. They're just silent. It doesn't really matter for the municipal properties so much because they're exempt from zoning, but the civic properties, the museums, the churches, other nonprofits that are designated civic, they don't have a building height assigned to them. And we found in the past couple of years, a couple of the one museum and one church has come before us, and I'll walk you through that example. And the Warner House being one has tried to add, and they were successful, but they had to go to the zoning board of adjustment to get relief to put an accessory structure where one used to be next to their building. So we'd like to assign some basic dimensional controls to civic and municipal properties, including building height. We certainly need to address any new streets, ways, or public places that have been added since we've last amended this, which I think 2015 is maybe 16's the last set of amendments relating to the map. Foundry Place has been built as an example. I'll show you that. And then adjust the building height along, in a very focused manner, along High Street and Haven Court, and I can talk to you about why that's in here. So the second area that we're going to look at is how to interpret or allocate building height across lots that have multiple building heights. So a through lot or a corner lot that might have multiple building height standards applied to it. The code already provides, I think, pretty good clarity on how you interpret that, but we've run into a couple of applicants that don't see it as clear. And we'd like to maintain past practice, which I'll present tonight, as to how we've interpreted it in the last 7 years, and make sure if we want to continue doing that, we tighten up the language so we don't have disputes in interpretation. I already talked about number 3, which is, again, applying some dimensional and development standards to civic districts. And then 4, really tackle a couple of the issues in the building height measurement formula or structure in the ordinance. I think most people probably here realize that the code allows a applicant to backfill the first floor. You can essentially put a basement on the ground or a first floor story on the ground, backfill it, make it a basement, and then start your measuring from that point forward. A good example of that is the new building that Chinburg did down at Hannaford's. That was the former city site, the DPW. They put a first floor garage on the existing grade, backfilled, built a podium, and then put the 4 stories on top of that. They didn't do anything they weren't allowed to do, but the code, we're seeking to tighten that up and look at finished grade differently than existing grade to calculate the height. So you'd see some of these buildings be shorter.
Nick, before you move on,
Yep.
I just want to draw attention to, a question was raised about how do we know what the objective is for each of the amendments? And the tables do really clearly show these objectives for each set of amendments. We hope to continue that practice for every set of amendments that we bring forward, identifying what the intent is, what the general objective is, and then the specific area to be targeted, if that's helpful. I'm sorry.
Right. So in going back to the map here, and the first 3 pieces that we're trying to address on the map, first one, again, creating building height standards for civic and municipal properties. The second, adding any new streets or ways, and it's really focused on Foundry Place at this point being the new street that's been added in the last 5 years. And then adjust, if we want to, the building height standards on Haven Court and High Street. So if we just go with the first one, the maps that were included in the draft amendment that I think was sent to you prior to tonight showed the existing building height map and the proposed. And the focus obviously is on the proposed. These are all the gaps that you currently see in the existing building height map, which is shown on the lower right. All the spaces where you don't have a color line in front of the property is because it's either municipal or civic behind it. So what we're proposing to do is basically rubber sheet the lines from the abutting properties onto the municipal and civic properties. So again, we have a min and a max building height for any of those properties that are looking for additions, alterations, or in the case of the Warner House, a new outbuilding being added to the property. All right. So the second component here was adding new streets, and Foundry Place was completed after 2015 when the zoning was adopted and last revised for the north end. It's shown here with the brown line. I put the brown line there because right now, as I think most of you are aware, those properties were in consolidated ownership until recently and had all gone through the permitting process to varying degrees for any number of outcomes, none of which have yet occurred. But the properties related to Foundry Place are all currently, a brown line is already, I wish I could get up and have a microphone. There isn't one, is there?
Don't touch the screen.
Yeah, we'll touch the screen. Oh. So, and we'll get close to it. So that's lot 6 right there from Rogers. Perfect. Is that you, Rick?
You want this?
Yeah, maybe I'll do that because I'm sure it'll drive Kevin nuts.
Yes, it will. He's bringing you the microphone.
All right. Good. Might be easier. All right. So that's lot 6 where the mixed-use building was approved and they have a foundation permit. I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds here, but that was lot 6 for the Rogers. This was where the hotel was going on lot 3. And then there's 2 more lots going out along Deer Street to Maplewood. All of those right now on the existing map, which you can't see here. Go back one slide. Yeah, that's great. So the existing map, and of course I've got it overlapping here. I'm not going to be able to move that, am I? No. Okay. Oops. Okay. But all those lots around the parking garage currently are already, the brown line comes down Deer Street, turns the corner on Bridge, and comes uphill all the way to here. So all these lots are already, the brown signifies 4 stories or 50 feet as the maximum building height. We're not changing that with this amendment. At least it's not being proposed to change it. If people want to talk about changing it differently, you're certainly welcome to, but I'm just presenting what's in front of you tonight. And what is being proposed is the balance of Foundry Place coming down along the garage in the back of Heinemann would be the same as the brown lines that circumvent the perimeter of these properties today. And then the Happney property down here that really doesn't have open frontage outside of this new cul-de-sac on Foundry Place because Rock Street is blocked and doesn't come, it's not through traffic. He currently needs a building height. So what we're proposing around that cul-de-sac is a lower standard, more consistent with his building in the context of that neighborhood that abuts the Rock Street Park. So we can talk about that. What's your preference? Talk about it now or go through all this and then come back?
I was just noticing that the stuff that was given to us doesn't include around the
loop?
cul-de-sac, which is fine because you're explaining it. But I think the other thing, just so everybody understands, the basic planning criteria is you like to have building heights the same across the street.
Front page.
You want to transition across the back lot line, not across the front. So I think like the solid brown line would actually be 2 brown lines on each side of the street.
That's right.
So
It
just as
will,
you're thinking
yeah.
about this.
No, good point, Rick. Anybody else have any questions about at least what's being contemplated here for that street?
We have a question.
Yep.
Nick, I know I had just more recently sent you a lot of the information that had been gathered and put together by some prior neighborhood people, but I think on our forward-looking possible changes, I think we need to look at Hill Street. I've never truly understood why the brown goes around the corner and down Hill Street when the rest of Bridge Street is all green. So I think we need to probably take a look at whether or not Hill Street is appropriate and whether or not the rest of Bridge Street is appropriate, because it's green across the street, it's green all the way down Bridge, but it's not green, down the street that has some of, smaller buildings, so.
Yep,
Yeah.
I hear the question, and I can at least tell you, when we did the brown down here, which you're correct, it's brown down to Hill
It's
Street.
green across the street.
Oh, yeah. There are plenty of streets downtown with opposite heights on
Yeah.
each side of the street because the context is different or it's a transition to a different zone. So what gets tricky about that particular intersection of Hill, obviously this is pretty intimate and low in terms of building heights. So I definitely think it's worth revisiting, especially if we're going to address the bottom.
Right.
With the taller, more appropriate building height along Foundry Place, that we take a look at whether that's the right way to do it with that brown. I think that's a legitimate question. You guys can barely see the brown on here, but there's the brown line going down there. And the brown does turn the corner, and it turns the corner because it's a reasonable expectation to expect the Ferguson or the gray building there to be replaced at some point in the next 20, 30 years. It's a single-story building from the 1970s that sits here, and it's highly unlikely that's going to be there 30 years from now. And it makes sense for that building to be commensurate with its neighborhood, which is really here. And again, there's a 10-foot difference between the green and the brown, but that's all it is. It's not like it's a 2.5-story house and all of a sudden you get a 60-foot building. It is a 10-foot difference between the green and the brown. So that's where it gets tricky when you have transitions of this being redeveloped next to a much lower area being developed, and that gets into the whole through lot, step down provision that we're going to get into next or shortly. Yeah. Jim.
Nick, how will this, the brown line on Foundry Place affect the Heineman property, since it has green on the front and brown on the back? Because I understand that Heineman property touches Foundry Place also.
Yes. So right now, the Heineman building sits right here, and it is, as you say, green, so it's allowed to be 3 stories or 40 feet. If this was adopted on the lower side, which is a 10-foot increase, right, to 50 feet, and this is, I think it's outside the overlay district, but I'd have to go back and look at that for the bonus. But the brown would definitely be up to 50 instead of the 40. But if this building was redeveloped and somebody wanted to put another story on top of this, they wouldn't be able to do any extra building in this first 50 feet along Hanover Street. So this would be one of those through lots, right, with 2 building heights, a brown on the back and a green on the front. What it says is on up to 50 feet from the lower standard, which is here, so you'd be back behind these cars, that's where your building could pop up and take advantage of the 50 feet, but it wouldn't be anywhere near Hanover Street. So again, it's trying to work the transition. There's already a 10-foot or more grade change down on Foundry to get up to even the Heineman building, the first floor. So I'm not sure they'd even get an extra story if that's brown, unless it's in the overlay district, which they'd already be in. We're not changing that. If they're in the overlay district now, and I can look it up before I leave, they would already be able to get an extra story with the community space or the workforce housing. So I'll look that up, but I don't think it's problematic, at least to my eyes. Because of the step back requirements from Hanover Street, you wouldn't be able to bring that brown line up to Hanover to start crowding the buildings on that street. With Peter Hapney's place next to the park, his building's probably already in the mid-30s. This is a 40-foot, it's like Bridge Street, 3 stories, 40 feet, seemed like an appropriate scale for that building. And we do have the Rock Street Garage. I felt like the Rock Street Park is a really useful transition for the Heineman building, should it get taller, to provide a buffer to the lower scale residential neighborhood on the other side. That's the thought anyway.
Heineman is in the overlay.
Say it again?
Heineman is.
Okay, yeah. So right now they can already do a 50-foot building if they provide the community space. Thanks, Rick. So this would allow 60 feet for that back portion if they did it and provided the community space.
And that 60 feet would be measured from Foundry Place? The street level there?
We'll talk about how it gets measured. You measure around the perimeter of the building, so you have to you get demerit points for being on Foundry, and you get credit for being on the height. You've got to go around the building every 5 feet, 6 feet off the building, add up all your data points, divide by the number of data points, create your grade plane, measure up to the roof, and calculate your average height of the building. So there would be portions, for example, for Heinemann, if they were allowed to go to 60 feet in the code as the maximum height, and it was, let's say, 5 stories, they could have sections on Foundry Place that might be in the high 60s, and they'd have sections on Hanover that would probably be in the low 50s, and it would average out. Again, if they were, it's going to average. You get it. Okay. Are we good just for now? We can come back. Okay, I talked a little bit about this. That's the Warner House there that came in for the building. This is not a big deal, but it was a little embarrassing that they came in to put a building there, and we didn't have dimensional standards to tell them, how close they needed to be or far away from the street and how tall the building could be. So they went to the BOA. They got the relief for what they wanted because we didn't have the well-defined dimensional standards. So this amendment is, this one here is adding in building heights to all those municipal and civic properties. So I jumped ahead to the dimensional. But this is putting building heights on all these properties that are consistent, and many of them are going to be non-conforming. The churches certainly are well beyond these colors, but they're landmark buildings. They're supposed to be. We're certainly not trying to create 80, 90-foot height districts for those buildings. But it would allow them, for example, St. John's did work in a connector building between the function hall and the church, and we didn't have any building height standards to do that. It wasn't a problem because what they were doing was appropriate, and we had the backstop, and we usually do, of the Historic Commission, being able to manage even what the code says you can do and finding the right fit. Any questions on and the map will be a lot easier to read without all these gaps for a pump station on Deer Street and Market. It's a little missing corner. The idea is that every street down here or public place, alleyway, is going to have a building height on it regardless of what the ownership is of the land behind it or fronting on it. We can yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Just to clarify, a civic property is defined as one that doesn't pay taxes?
No, I don't think that. I think you'll probably find that's true, but that's not how they're defined. They're defined in the code, and maybe Rick can pull it out there. They're nonprofits, they're museums. So I don't know that they have to be nonprofit and tax exempt, but they probably are.
Okay. All right, I thought it was a simple answer, so if it's not, I'll look at it.
Yeah, well, I'll find it for you when I free up my hands. It's in there, the definition of civic. Okay. Let's talk about High Street and Haven Court, because I'm sure there's interest in this. It's kind of an oddity in the package as to, it's a substantive change to the building height standards on the map, and it's clearly related to recent conversations about the appropriateness of the building heights on High Street and Haven Court. And you can see, just as a starting point, the existing heights. You can see it fairly well here. The orange is a 3-story short for 4th-story building. If you want to know what short fourth is, it's just a compressed 4th floor, but it's essentially a 3-story district with a short 4th or 45 feet, whichever is higher. So you can't go above 45 feet, and you can't go above a 3-story building with a short 4th floor. You think of the Starbucks building right across the road from the corner. That's got a short 4th floor. It's a little compressed. It's the federal style that's commonly found in 1800, where perhaps the servants' quarters were in the attic and the windows are shorter and the floor-to-ceiling heights are lower. It can't be more than 80% of the height of the floor below it, that short 4th. So right now, along Congress Street and almost all of High Street, this gets into sort of the question earlier Beth was asking about Bridge Street. There's an example where the heights are different on both sides, and sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. What's important to me at the end of the day, and I think it should be to all of us, well, what is the difference between the green and the orange? And the difference between the green and the orange is pretty subtle. It's 5 feet. So you're not jumping up a full story. You do get the short 4th, but a 3.5-story building in a mansard is going to work even in the green district, provided it's less than 40 feet. So the folks that are looking at that property right now, and I think they've even maybe been in front of the planning board, I'm not sure, yeah. They approached us early on about interpreting the code and interpreting how a lot merger is going to function, because this becomes a corner lot with 3 potential street frontages. It's got Congress Street down here, it's got High Street, and it's got Haven Court. And we have argued repeatedly that Haven Court is a public place. It may not be a full-on street like High Street, but it is a right-of-way. The city owns the fee of the lower section down here, and we believe we have a right-of-way through here. So it's a pedestrian right-of-way. It's similar to Commercial Alley. It does have a service component. But potentially that lot that's been merged, and I think the planning board may have signed the merger, so you're well aware of this, the building on the corner was merged with the building in the middle, which included the parking lot. They used to have a building on it quite a long time ago. I don't think anyone in the room has seen that building. It's been gone since, I think, the 40s. So the question we were asked is, gee, how does building height work? How do you allocate the building height when we have an orange line on the front and this side all the way down to Rudy's? We have an orange line, and then we have this green thing, and it's 5 feet shorter. It's just 5 feet shorter, but it's different. And what we're trying to do is build a building here that's commensurate with the orange line, and you got a green line here. So another part of these amendments that I'm hoping we can support is to clarify the code that you can't drag a higher building height from as far away as where the address is, which is Congress Street, and pull it all the way to Haven Court, which is one of the arguments being made by the applicant in this case in front of the Board of Adjustment. We don't support it. That's why it's in front of the Board of Adjustment, because for 7.5 years that we've been doing this, we believe, as I presented earlier, in this particular case, you can take this building height and push it into the green box here, but only back in this corner. So there's a 50-foot step back from Haven Court and a 50-foot step back from High Street. So there's really not much of a bleed over of the orange into the back of the site because of that 50-foot step back. But they've taken a different route in interpreting that. What we're proposing in a subsequent amendment in this package is to tighten the language so we don't get into these conversations in the future, and we can continue to do what we intended to do, which is protect the street edge from a tall line moving into a short line because of a sleight of hand with the language or an interpretation. So the reason this is in here for changing the actual map is because it makes sense, at least to us, and me in particular, that regardless of what I think about the building design that's being proposed, and I'm probably not the biggest fan, I'll just say it, of the style of the building, but that's an HDC problem to solve. To me, it's completely appropriate here. When we did this building height map, look, we're not going to get everything perfect. We've made changes to this repeatedly from 2013, 14, 15, because this was the first phase, the downtown. So when we did the north end, we came back over and discovered, several things weren't right. We're back again. I do not see why, with the buildings that are in this context being already 3 to 4 stories in height, 40 to 45 feet in height, the garage even more, that it makes sense to dig in and say, no, this 5 feet sacrosanct, that really needs to be green when everything around it is essentially orange and on the ground. Again, building design aside, this is not going to unlock the ability to go and put that building, whether you like it or not, on this site. All it's going to do is avoid needing to argue and duke it out at the Board of Adjustment as to whether that 5 feet should be added or not. So personally, I've got an image in here that I encourage you to go down there as well and take a look. I mean, I did a lot of the analysis back in 2013 and the data collection to come up with these heights. That parking lot was sitting there. We knew at some point it would get developed. We put the green line on there, without the level of thought you'd like if you're looking at every street, with your sleeves rolled up. We did 80 acres and 452 properties in that first zoning amendment, so it was a heavy lift, and building height is only one of the 34 dimensional controls that goes with each property. So I personally don't think when you look down High Street and you look at that Haven Court section there where the truck's parked, that a 5-foot increase is going to be a problem here at all. I think it's appropriate. I think there's plenty of work for the HTC to do on the building design, but that, again, is not part of this amendment. This does not allow that to happen. It just avoids building height being part of it. And, hey, look, one thing you're going to see in a subsequent slide here, we've inserted language in this set of amendments to make it very explicit to the marketplace that the HDC has the ability to allow and require a lower building than the maximum building height that's allowed on that map. So if for example, I'll take it in just a sec, Peter. If, for example, somebody came in here with a 45-foot building and the HDC thought it was too big for that context, based on the surrounding context, they have jurisdiction to require that building to be lower. Remember, the building height map is usually 2 stories to something. So there's a range between 2 and the top. And obviously, the development community likes to come in at the very top, but there's no obligation for the HDC in the historic district to allow a building to be only at the top. And there's been several buildings that have been lowered, not exponentially, but they've been lowered, or penthouses have been made, pitched roofs have been made instead of flat roofs, which has had a profound impact on how that perceived height works to the pedestrian. Peter?
So the green on the Metro or the Ruiz lot there,
Yes.
how is that assigned, or historically, how did that become that versus the orange? Or, I mean, is it because that's what the building was there before?
No.
Is there-
No, that's a great question, and I
I
wish.
mean, I don't understand,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can tell you because I think I put it there. And I think it was me looking at it initially saying, being conservative and being careful. And I've always felt less is more when you're taking a lot on, and you can't roll up your sleeves to your shoulders to make sure you've covered every contingency. I think it was a very careful approach to that intersection and that lot, because it was obvious to me and many others it wasn't going to remain like that in this development climate. It was going to be developed. And, if this was going to change 10 feet or 15 feet, I think it would be a worthwhile endeavor to beat it. But we're talking 5 feet. And
The Newberry building next to the lot?
Yes.
Going up Glad Street, or
Yes.
going up Haven Court there?
So it's a 3-story building here, which is, it's under 40 feet. It's basically, that building is commensurate with a 40-foot building down on the street with 3 stories, and it's 2 stories on the back because of the grade change coming up Haven Court. I mean, Gillies right here is basically a 8 to 9 foot building in a 40-foot district, right next to a 65 to 70-foot building. So this is imperfect. But it's better than what it used to be, which was 60 feet everywhere. Everything was 60 feet in 2013, and it was 60 feet in 1950, all the way through. Before 1950, it was 100 feet and 10 stories, but that's because nobody wanted to invest here, so they were trying to induce development. But the 60 feet was changed in the whole downtown in 1980 when the Sheridan lot was going to be developed with a 10-story building. People panicked and went with the 60, and the 60 was everywhere except the north end, which was 50, the CBA versus the CBB. So when I got here, everything, Sheep Street was 60, the end of State Street was 60, and what was happening from 100 Market Street all the way to 2013 is 100 Market Street's really the first building that was 59.95 feet. And everybody did the same thing that got a piece of property in downtown, and we're 12 buildings in before we started making adjustments at the council. And then the council put the money up to do the character-based zoning and the data collection. So, yeah, I would argue we've extinguished a third of the development rights in 2013 of the property owners downtown. So it was a pretty big take on what was there at 60 feet everywhere to drop to these the green, it goes from 60 to 40, the blue steps down again. We've got some 30-foot districts, so.
We got another question, Nick, from
Yeah, sorry.
Andrew.
Well, when you pointed out, like,
Speak into the microphone because people can't hear you.
when you pointed out like that, when it went from 100 to 60 to 50 to 40, the 5 feet we're talking about doesn't seem all too dramatic. But my two-pronged question is, does the form and function of the short fourth floor in this district have any influence on the height that you will be able to get?
No, because building height is either the number of stories or the maximum height, and whichever you hit, you stop. If you have a McIntyre building with 15, 16-foot floors, you're only going to get a couple before you hit the ceiling on the number of feet. So it's both number of stories or feet. When you hit the ceiling on either one of them, you got to stop.
The reason for the question was because you had mentioned that the HDC could moderate that and
Yes.
bring it down lower. So if that were the case, and they would somewhat compromise, quote unquote, to arrive at a nicer roof line or a mansard roof, et cetera, although it may be a little bit higher than that maximum height if we were to go with the shorter height.
I don't know if I got the last part of what you said. The HDC obviously can't make anything taller than the maximum building height, so there's no wiggle room there. If this goes to 45 in this particular, we're really talking that parking lot, right? The HDC can approve something 45, 42, 38, whatever they find the right fit is. And whether it has a short fourth or, I don't believe the building they're actually presenting now has a short fourth story. I think it's a mansard, but it's so odd looking, it's tough to figure out what it is, at least without rolling up your sleeves again pretty high. So, but the building I do know that they're proposing is about 43 and change, 44 feet in height. So it exceeds the green line of 40.
Okay.
But again, this isn't, I don't want people to think this is being done to make that project happen. It's done to make a project happen. The zoning is to make a project happen. This isn't a parking lot forever. It's intended to be either purchased by the city and a park made out of it, or the private property owner is going to develop it at some point, like most of these parking lots. So the code is telling, it's our business plan as to what we want to see happen in the future on this property. And I think it's in our interest to have a little more flexibility, especially knowing it's in the historic district and they are under no obligation to go 44 and a half feet if it's not a good fit based on their analysis of what's around it and what's before them.
Yeah, so the other half of my statement was going to be, I think I take comfort in the fact that if it were to go higher, the other dimensional constraints and requirements of the zoning would push towards a better experience with that building at the street level, which I think is how most people will interact with it. So if Haven Court becomes a nice pedestrian throughway like Commercial Alley, as we've discussed here, then I would like to see that building set back a little bit further so that people walking out of the garage or out of any other building in that area are not greeted with a staunch wall at their face. So if it were to be set back but a little bit higher, I don't think that would be the end of the world. I think that would be a healthy way to create a good experience for that corner.
So, I mean, I don't disagree, but that entire conversation is an HDC conversation.
Right, so I guess it ties in because if you were to go with the higher floor height,
Yes.
then they have more control.
Not necessarily. All we're doing, I just want everybody to be, including myself, clear on the question and the answer. All we're talking about doing here is only changing the maximum height 5 feet higher.
Setting the boundaries.
Sorry?
Setting the boundaries.
Yeah, setting the boundaries, exactly.
Not the
So
style.
if the HDC was to decide, as you suggested might be a good idea, if the building was 45 feet, they'll step it back a foot or two so the sidewalk's wider. That's something that has to be negotiated between the HDC. The code is not going to require them to step the building back. That whole step back conversation was buildings that have multiple building heights and how you bring a taller one to a short street with a shorter building height. If that turns into orange around that corner, then the whole thing is orange. All the buildings are already conforming to the orange that are on Congress Street and the first half of High Street. So really, it's again 5 feet in there, and I'm going to say it 16 times because it's important, this will not enable that building design as contemplated currently to be approved just because this amendment goes forward. The HDC is where you want to participate and monitor how they review it and shape that project.
So Nick, the change to go to orange or brown, whatever
Green.
we're calling it, changing from green, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a correction, but it is making it consistent with what's across the street, like what I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'm calling it a minor adjustment.
So from the other changes, because we've got them on two different maps, so it's a little hard to go back and forth. The proposed changes, where are you doing it so that it's not consistent across the street? Do you remember if that's?
Can you ask me that again?
Are you proposing any changes, additions to the map, where we have a disparity across the street? I think you're consistent in every case, right?
No. What I can tell you is there are some corner lots and through lots like Congress Street today that exist that have multiple building heights that I'm not trying to address here. I don't think that's a different problem.
Well, no, simpler question.
Sorry.
Where you filling in the colors, the
Yes.
missing colors?
Yes.
Those match what was on the other side of the street?
He's talking about the
Or
civic
beside it.
municipal.
Or
Beside
beside
it.
it. Yes. Yes. It's rubber sheeted.
So this is actually a standout.
Yes.
If this hadn't any color on it,
Yes.
you probably would have picked brown
Orange, you mean?
or orange.
Yeah. Brown being taller.
Okay.
Yeah.
Orange. It's so thin, it's hard to,
Yeah.
on the, okay, so,
Yeah, I think you could go green or orange here, and it's kind of irrelevant. What's relevant is the building that they put into that space and whether it fits.
I agree.
that's a separate question with
I-
HDC, you know?
Exactly.
And one quick thing, just with what Andrew brought up, that stepping function, that could be built into the ordinance. It's not. It could be.
Yeah.
That's a separate conversation, so we can talk about that later.
And they used to have that here before the 1950s. You could go 12 stories if you stepped the building in. You know, sort of new. I mean, probably peeled it out of New York City in the 30s.
What
But
if it's one or the other? You could do the step in and have a little more height, or you don't do the step in, but you have to be lower. I mean, is that?
That's commonly the way it's done.
I mean, we kind of do that with the penthouse exemption today. That if it's 15 feet in, you get another story and you get an extra 2 feet in height. You don't. It's not called a story; it's a penthouse. So we're trying to encourage in the code pitched roofs instead of flat roofs. So we get the mansard, we get the pitched roof, we get the popovers, so the building looks shorter than it is when you're inside. There'll be 5 floors and popovers, but it reads like a 4-story building when you're on the sidewalk. So, you know, we already have those sort of step backs. They're not quite what, you know, the penthouse is certainly what you're talking about.
Sorry for the diversion, so go ahead.
Yeah.
Jim, you have a question?
Yeah, just while we had this slide up, I have a question about the ownership of Haven Court.
Yes.
The tax maps clearly show it as public property, clearly show it as Portsmouth's property. But as you probably know, there's a Jersey barrier and a
Yeah.
fence
Right here.
and an
right
unfriendly
down there.
sign saying no trespassing private property. Who is contending that it's not city property? Do you know?
Well, there was some suggestion from these folks here that because it was based on a map, they believe a plan that's valid, it's recorded, it's a survey. And the survey plan that they presented to us showed what we knew to be true, which is from the back of the Newbury building down to Gillies. We actually do own the fee of that. That plan that they showed us that we own the fee from Gillies up to the Jersey barriers. Those Jersey barriers are on city property, both top and bottom. But when you get to the top ones where the dumpster is and that big truck was parked, that is not owned by the city in fee. We have a right-of-way across that section, and the owner of that parking lot owns the fee of that section.
Okay,
But we
so-
believe it's a public way, we believe it's a public place, so we believe the green line is enforceable, and we believe the orange line, should it become it, will be enforceable, so this lot will be on 3 streets.
All right, so there's 2 issues with Haven Way. There's an easement or a right-of-way, so to speak, on
Right-of-way.
private property. And then there's fee simple on another section
Correct.
that the city owns outright.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, the ramp section we own, the flat section on top is apparently owned by this property owner, and we apparently have a right-of-way to cross it and recross. So we consider it a public way, so these lines, in our opinion, apply.
So the city at any moment could remove those Jersey barriers if it chose to?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think we put them there. They've been there a long time.
I think
Oh,
it was
so-
because there was some
There
bad
was
stuff
there was
going on
some
in
stuff
that
going
alley.
on
Oh, so the
30 years
city
ago.
didn't want people in there?
Right.
No.
Oh, I
Yes,
got
It
you. I
was
thought it
another
was-
era.
All right, now I get it. Now
Yeah,
I-
so it's a great time to go and fix it and make it like commercial alley, which would be great.
When they had gates to go to Pierce Island, too.
Which?
And they used to have gates to get up to Pierce Island.
Right, there was bad stuff going on.
Nick, so what happens to the Newberry building in that green line if you decide to make the other lot orange?
Yeah, so if the orange, right now, I think I've showed the orange coming down to the Jersey barriers here. We can certainly put it wherever. I don't think you're going to see anything happen here on the Newbury building, but if the orange line comes to here, right, where the Jersey barriers are at the top, they're only going to be able to build back here on top of that roof up to the orange maximum height, the 45 feet, which is the same as this lot, and this lot. So I think it's highly doubtful they would do that, because this building right here, if you don't change the green, it's really at the max already. So you can't put a story on this whole building without a variance, even with this amendment. So you'd be putting something on the back, and I can't believe that's financially feasible, even though a lot of things are now that didn't used to be. Yeah. So I'm not going to sit here and say we've figured out every contingency and there won't be a problem over the next 30 years. We hope to avoid them. Shall I continue? All right.
Please.
So you saw that context. All right. This is really a Scribner error, but we decided, since we didn't notice it too many times over the last 7 years, we better include it. That 7 you see there is supposed to be a 6. There is no 7. Oops. Why did so? So, and that's shown on the building height map where the arrow is. There's a reference to 5A47, and there isn't such a thing. So that's all that is. And there it is in the actual print. The 7 turns into a 6. Wish they were all that easy. Okay, the corner and through lots, we spent a lot of time on this, but this is dealing with things like Congress Street, and I've got an example in here that's not Congress Street, so you hopefully will all get it. This is the language here that was giving us grief on Congress Street in having a different interpretation than us as to how, in particular, item C relates to dragging the orange line back into the green on Congress Street. And they had a different interpretation as to what it meant than us, and we believed a front lot line is on any of those streets. So there's a front on High, a front on Haven, and a front on, they're all fronts. But because the word, you've got the language of the existing code in that document that was handed out, it allowed the attorney representing the applicant to suggest, well, it's either or, and since we don't have a street, a front lot line, which you're going to see is a revised definition in here, a front lot line defines itself as where the address of the property comes from. And this merged lot now has an address of 1 Congress Street. 1 Congress Street is on an orange line. So if you read this as an either or, and the front lot line is defined as Congress Street, then you bring the orange line all the way to Haven Court, which we disagree with. That's why they're in front of the BOA on that particular item. So what we've decided to do here is, if there's any ambiguity, which obviously there must be some or they wouldn't have filed an administrative appeal, let's fix it. And let's make sure we maintain the position we've taken for 7 years, which is you can't take the Congress Street orange line and bring it to Haven Court. You can only bring it as long as it's 50 feet back from High Street and 50 feet back from Haven. You can bring it back into that little corner, but that's not useful to them. Is that semi-clear? It's a little complicated. So this is the language that we're amending, and you know, these lots that have multiple building heights sometimes on them, they can be corner lots, which is Congress. They can be a through lot, which would be the buildings that are on Sheaf and State Street. They go right through, and Sheaf is obviously a lower building height than State Street. So this whole section here of ABCD, it applies to lots that have multiple building height standards on them, either because they're on the waterfront, like the North Mill Pond, or they're a through lot, like the ones on State Street, or they're a corner lot, like the ones on Haven Court and Congress. So we're cleaning up the language here to be consistent between corner lots, through lots, and waterfront lots. That's the purpose. Now, this definition is in the back for front lot line, and this is what the attorney was using to build the case that Congress Street should be utilized to get the building height extended all the way to Haven Court. It refers to the strikeout portion here. I don't know why this turned into a dot, but the front lot line, we're proposing that be replaced with the principal front yard, which is already defined in the code. And that's what the address defines, is the main front yard, the principal front yard, not the only front yard, which is the way this person's suddenly interpreted it, is that the address gives you the front yard, and therefore you can pull that height over to Haven Court. So we hope that this addresses, and you know, it's not 2 front lot lines, could be multiple, and we just demonstrated on Congress Street there would be 3, not 2, with Haven Court being added. Go ahead, Peter. Did you have a question?
So what
Yeah.
happens, this is being discussed to be changed in there in front of the BOA.
They're in a holding pattern to see what happens here. They're still,
Okay.
they have to keep their application going because they want to protect their ability to, if all this tanks and we decide not to do it, they're still going to need to pursue their application, but they've continued.
So this will affect their,
Yeah, and this does not give them what they want. This gives us what we want. The piece that they will avoid is that 5 feet from the 40 to the 45, which again, I think makes sense for us to do, and then work on the building design secondarily. So, again, this is, I think, the same thing you just saw on the last slide. Here's another example up on.
Nick, if you
back
could
up.
just hold one
Yeah.
second. I think there has been some changes between what was presented in their packet, and then
Yes.
this captures the change.
Yes.
And I only draw attention to that because I think we are trying to also present to the planning board tonight we conferred with legal, and we noodled through, and if something wasn't clear, this particular section I felt like wasn't entirely clear, and Nick and I sat down and worked on it a little bit more with legal. So I want to be able to capture, I know you have that in the handouts as well, but to capture the changes that staff has recommended. There's no, I would say, substantive changes. It's still what's in your packet. It's just more clarifying changes.
And there's a copy that Steph is going to get, that, in case you don't have it, of all the changes that are shown here that we've been working on in the last week. 'Cause, yeah, Beverly's right. We've done continuous wordsmithing.
been ongoing.
Yeah, it's probably not done.
Thank you.
Okay, so if we just pop up to the Hill Street neighborhood again, what we talked about earlier. So this is Lot 6 over here. Wow, what is going on?
Hold it down,
Yeah, and?
the top. You should be able to toggle through the different types.
Oh. Well, I'll stick with that, I guess. This is Lot 6 again. The parking garage is over here. Foundry Place is there. This is the existing brown line that Beth was talking about that goes all the way down to Bridge Street. So I just tried to use, this is one property with 3 structures on it. They're all 2 families. There's 6 units here. This came before the planning board a couple of years ago, I think it did. Maybe it was the Board of Adjustment, and it did not obtain its zoning relief, so it never made it to the planning board. But what the property owner who owns these buildings tried to do was a taller building than would be allowed in this green area because of that 50-foot step down. I mean, there's no real, that's the only space here on this lot. If these were all torn down, and that was a vacant lot, this is the only space on that lot that could be 4 stories or 50 feet because of the brown line. This is the 50-foot step down out to the green. I have to point this thing at the ceiling to get it to, maybe it's somewhere else. So that's a 50-foot step back from Hanover and from Autumn Street. So this building would have to be 3 stories or 40 feet in here, and this is where it could bump up because, again, it's at least 50 feet away from the green line. That particular project did not have a step down like that. It was a uniform height. It was more like it was 3.5 stories and probably 45 feet, and it had a garage coming in from here. It was not approved by the Board of Adjustment. But the purpose of showing you this is how that allocation works, again, like Congress Street, on a lot that has multiple building heights on it. And this one has 2 building heights. It has 3 front yards, Autumn, Hanover, and Hill. But that's how the building height has worked for the last 7 years. That's how we've interpreted it, for better or worse. I mean, it's not a great outcome. Thankfully, we don't have people building buildings like that. But that at least protects the people in the neighborhood on Hanover and Autumn from having the brown higher height bleed into their neighborhood across the street. So it's a disincentive for a developer. They'd have to go to the Board of Adjustment to get relief to do that. All right. I don't know where the definition went, but it was on there. It's in the handout. Oh, there it is. So we don't have a definition today for public place. It's referred to in the front lot line, and this is really helpful when you're dealing with things like Haven Court or Commercial Alley, because they're not necessarily public streets. They're not for vehicular traffic, but they are public ways, and they're either alleyways or some form of community space. The legal department recommended we strike the word deeded. If they have public access, we don't want to be too restrictive and say it has to be deeded. Most of the time it's going to be deeded, but sometimes I guess it's informal, and we want to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. But we've got a lot of new alleyways that are being both proposed and constructed that this would affect. All right, this goes back to the HDC, the disclaimer. We're proposing to insert the underlined text into this introductory paragraph to the building height standards. And it simply refers you as a reader when you're in the historic district to that section, 63570, which is the review criteria, to make it clear to the applicant especially, and also the HDC members that come and go, that the HDC does not have to approve the maximum building height just because it says the maximum is 40, 50, or 60. So it's kind of a clarifying statement to the marketplace that if you're in the district, you should go look at the criteria and not assume you're going to get a 60 or 50-foot building just because it says you can ask for one. So
Again,
that's
this is slightly different than what's in your packet, but it is the same intent and it expresses the same thing. It's just a little bit more clear.
Yeah, that's the intention. That's and that's not a substantive change to the code. It's just belt and suspenders. That the HDC already has that jurisdiction. It's just not always clear to people. They do, including some of them. So mansard roofs, this actually came up a couple of times over the last couple of years, and Liz Bratter brought it to me when she was looking at 1 Congress Street and maybe 64 Vaughn Street. But there's been an inconsistency in the code probably for 15 or 20 years in respect to the building height definition at the back of the code, and this illustration that's embedded in the definition. The illustration, I think, is the appropriate way to deal with a hip-top mansard roof, which has multiple roof planes and typically dormers coming out of the roof, like the lower section of popovers. You measure building height to the mean of that roof, meaning the difference, the midpoint between the ridge and the gutter on the mansard. But if, in contrast, you do a building that has a flat top, like this one, you'd actually go all the way to the top of that building to calculate the building height itself. So these make sense to me, but if you read the text that sits on top of it, they actually don't correspond to the way a hip-top mansard is addressed in the text that goes with the image. So all I've done here is made a change that the flat-top mansard goes to the top of the roof. You don't get any credit for that one roof plane being tilted back. You've got to have the two planes with the dormers in order to get the credit to be able to go to the midpoint. And that's what the pitched roof, hip top, mansard, and gambrel roof. Those are all pitched roof buildings. I think you live in one, Peter, and that's exactly, it doesn't read in that attic as a full story. It's anyway.
That's why it was created.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nick,
For
could
taxes.
Could you go back to that slide
Yep.
showing the different types of roofs? It just confuses me why, depending on the style of building, where you'd measure the top of the roof. The top, when I go to the doctors, I get my height, it goes to the top of my head, not my nose. And I don't understand why a gambrel would be different than a mansard.
It isn't. The gambrel, like the one Peter lives in, is actually like a hip top mansard. He's got two roof planes. So this flat top mansard. Let me go back and answer the first part of the question. The roof plane above the top story has a profound impact on how the building feels at the street level. As you go by just downtown, you go by Port Walk, you go by Popovers, they're both 60-foot buildings. They don't feel like 60-foot buildings. The width of the street obviously affects it, but if you're on the sidewalk in front of Killam's Chocolate with a 58-foot building, that pitched roof, which is only going back a third of the way, and then there's a flat roof in there with all the mechanicals on the top of that building, it's got the dormers coming out of it. So as a pedestrian, the building feels more human scale than it would if it was like Port Walk Place. So the spirit of a hip-top mansard is that you're typically going to have windows like you see at the Provident Bank there down at 25 Maplewood. I'm certain if they had done a flat top and not done the mansard for that building, it would read very differently to anybody going by that site. So the idea is to encourage pitched roof buildings and not flat roof buildings because of the character of Portsmouth. And it's not always going to be perfect, but the flat top over on the lower right, that's maybe not the best example of accentuating why that building would look taller than the one on the left.
So is this a common measurement
Yeah.
scheme? Like if I go to Dover or
Yep.
Concord, you'll see this?
U.S. wide.
Okay,
Yeah.
just was curious.
No, it's a good question, and I think
I've seen it in other places as well. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
typical.
Very common.
In colonial times, the gambrels were created after Her Majesty started collecting taxes, and they taxed based on the number of windows below the roof line.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the French did that in Paris. Yeah.
Corey, did you have a question?
I was just, thank you, Nick, for addressing this one, because this one's come up a couple times. I can think of the project on the corner of Vaughan and Hanover that.
Yep.
But I guess the one comment I was going to make about that other picture in the corner is just flat top mansard roof with parapet greater than 2 feet. It's just,
So if it's not greater than 2, you actually jump down to the top of the roof.
right,
Yeah.
right. So, okay, yeah. I just didn't know. It's almost.
So that's probably in
With or
scale.
with-
That's a 6-foot parapet as drawn on that, or
Right.
5 feet. That's why they went to the top of it in the
I-
illustration.
I just didn't know in the text if we wanted with or without. Just
In the text, there's a section that allows you to have a 2-foot parapet on any building.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think we need to.
The other comment, does the slope of the roof portion
Yes.
make a difference too? Because obviously you can push that out and hang shingles on
There's a
whatever slope you
maximum.
want.
There's a maximum a slope that's in the code, at least in the character districts.
Okay,
Yeah, there isn't outside the historic, outside the character districts, there is no maximum pitch, I don't think. So it's something I'll look into.
okay.
All right. Somewhat clear, right? Okay, so we were here, and let's go to I think the last couple of slides. Two more sections, and we've already talked about this with the Warner House and the accessory building. There's no reference in the code for any dimensional controls for principal or accessory buildings. All we're proposing to do here is refer to the building placement and form standards for the CD4 district for any civic property. So
Slight
any of
change to this language as well.
We can come back to that. And these are the two sections of the code that are referenced in the CD4 that properties like the Warner House would be able to use and avoid going to the BOA to put an addition or an alteration. So the last piece of the, last but not least, of the amendments that are in this first phase is dealing with this issue of backfilling a property after you put the first story on the ground. So these are examples of some buildings that have done that, and again, they've been allowed to do this because the code enables it to happen, and all of these are outside the historic district, so there's no ability for them to say, oh, we don't like what you're doing, so lower it. This is 105 Bartlett, which obviously hasn't been built, but that was done in that particular instance. This is the Westerly on Lafayette, where the church used to sit. I mean, I don't know that it was unsuccessful when you go by this site. That's the least flattering look at the building that I took there. But if you see it from Lafayette, it actually isn't a bad-looking site. But they did build 4-story buildings and backfill the basements and turn them into 3-story buildings. And I don't think they did this to avoid any regulatory relief, but it's an example of how it happens. And that's the Chimberg building down at the bottom, next to Hannaford. So, pretty simple fix. This was what was in the copy sent out to you, was a new definition for the existing grade plane. I played with that a little more in the last couple of days, and I think it's in here as an extended version just to be clearer how you measure the height, 5 feet around the building, 6 feet off, and how you deal with the fact that you may not have 6 feet setback from either a water body or a street. So I tried to maintain consistency with the existing definition of grade plane as to how you actually measure it. But the idea here would be if somebody comes along, this is it here. So I've added that last 4 lines on that definition. Copies of this are all available here. And again, that language I just pulled out of the existing definition for grade plane and changed the word finish to existing. Because this would be what you use if you come along with any of these properties. You would use the existing grades to calculate your building height for your proposed building, and that's not the way it works now. And everybody's well aware the buildings are much taller than I think a lot of people anticipated when they get built. So that's a summary, I think.
One thing.
Yeah.
One thing that I would highlight there is that the Westerly project and the Chimberg project, to some extent, have built those buildings almost to hide the parking. And so now they've created either underground parking or sheltered parking away from some of the most trafficked streets that they sit on. So I don't mind that aspect of it. Obviously, there are exceptions and other examples that we could call out, but for those 2 examples, I think it worked in the favor of the city.
So that could be the case. The reason, I mean, look, we're dealing with development rights, and if Chimberg was only able, if Eric was only able to build a 3-story building with underground parking like the Westerly, somebody would do that. So it's not really always going to be the case that the parking being underground, even though it starts above ground and then gets backfilled, is necessarily a reason to have a building be 10 feet taller than the code anticipated. I think if we wanted a 60-foot building down there with parking on the ground that he wanted to backfill to make it look better, we should say that. But we shouldn't say it's 50 feet and then, wait, you can use the finished grade and you build a 60-foot building. So I think we need to just do things with intention. There are going to be buildings like that one that might be appropriate given their context. But it's not really fair to us or the neighborhoods if we don't know what's going to happen. And 10 feet makes a big difference in many of these situations.
When you say it that way, it does make sense, yes.
Yeah, I think this is completely appropriate because I think every other ordinance in every other town goes from original grade. And the way Portsmouth is written now, it's get an extra free story. Just bring in 10 feet of dirt, up you go. And it's the final height of the building that matters the most.
I don't disagree, and I'll tell you, there's even small-scale residential situations where people will bring in fill in order to put a deck and keep it below 18 inches above ground, even though it starts out 4 feet above ground, and they bring fill in underneath it in order to build it and raise the grade. So this can get used, inappropriately at any level, not just big projects like this.
And the word is out.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think that in the end, if they really want to do this and the site is unique enough, like the old DPW site, which kind of was a giant crater of a hole in that area. I mean, I think the building's really more to grade of the surrounding neighborhood, so they could always get a variance and we should be able to do that.
Yeah, or we change the code because we realize, hey, maybe the code needs to be different there. But
This is something I pointed out in the Golden Egg application. I tried to explain that to the board. I'm probably the only one, well, maybe a couple others can read the contours, but that's really going to go up a bit, quite a bit more than what's there. And that's because it's allowed under the ordinance.
It's the same builder as the Westerly.
Okay.
yeah,
So the only comment I have about existing grades is it could go the other way too, where they're doing a cut site, and therefore, you take the corner of Russell and Green, and that's, a 10-foot tall rock cut. You take that with this, and then therefore, now they've got another story because it's a cut site. I know I kind of talked to you, Rick, about it, about maybe doing the curb
Right.
rather. That would kind of address the DPW bowl issue or mound issue, if you will.
Could go
Because
either
then
way.
you're kind of following the curb.
The
Not- I
contour
mean,
of the neighborhood.
Granted, not every site has a curb all the way around it, but,
You could add a provision discussing curb line into the definition, because that is a way, in some codes I've worked on, we've used curb line. I think I mentioned that to you. It's a good point on Russell Street.
I mean, you're going to get a lot more of
Right.
filling situation than you are on cuts, but, there are some cuts that could occur.
all right, let's
Maybe you take a look
let's
at
keep
that.
talking about that. Not after tonight.
Yeah.
I'm interested. Yeah.
Like
Good
the house that was just built on, I guess the address is Lafayette, but as you're going down Lafayette, past the four-way intersection at the
Yes, I
ABC
know
building.
exactly what you're talking
It's
about.
on the right. There's a giant rock that they did blasting and cutting
Yeah.
and all of that. And that house does sit probably 3 feet higher than both on the other side.
Well, what's funny is they built the house and the foundation's farther up out of the ground because I didn't think they dug down probably as far as
Yeah.
the other houses. So then they just put a bunch of fill in front of the house to make it, give it a hill.
Precisely. Yeah.
I was like, great.
Actually, I remember when that one got subdivided and seeing the
Oh,
giant
yes.
rock, I was like,
Yeah, it was, I kept
That was a
wondering if
huge
anybody
rock.
would ever be able to get rid of that rock to build anything there.
yeah.
Yep.
Is that your presentation?
That is, yeah.
Could you go to the last slide, please? So just a reminder of the milestones. We actually showed this at the last planning board meeting. Here we are, May 5th, for the public planning board work session. On the 19th, we'll be having a public hearing and seeking a recommendation. Again, I advise you, and we will send out the revised red lines that capture some of the improvements recommended by Nick and clarifications from staff as we try and make sure that we all understand exactly what the terms mean as we read through those. So I think you've been handed a copy, I believe. Did we hand out the revised copy? So the dark red line, the black and white underlined strike-throughs are the most current version. And then we will have revised red lines, and then for the public hearing, for you to consider at your next regular meeting. Yes.
So, because of that date is, 2 weeks away, we get the presentation sooner?
We will get the presentation posted tomorrow and send you a link.
Thank you.
Any other board comments before we have public comments?
I just want to say this has been very helpful, and I appreciate all the work you guys have done on this.
Yes, thank you for all the work
Yeah.
you've done.
Yeah, very clear.
helpful.
Definitely.
Any folks in the audience like to say anything?
I appreciate Mr. Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave.
Why don't you come up and sit at the microphone so that the people can hear you on the recording.
Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave. First of all, happy Cinco de Mayo today. I think it was good to see it, and it was good to watch it, but I always go back to, I think it was probably your 6th slide, the picture of Portsmouth you used. Do you remember what the picture was?
I don't know.
I think it was the one with the master plan and the water view.
Yeah, it's all the water and it's all the cute little houses and all the cute little places. And that seems to be the picture that we always refer to as Portsmouth. So I would keep that in mind as we're thinking about our historical culture here. The one thing that makes us different than most communities is the history and our waterfront. So I would always celebrate it, and maybe some point we'll have a grand picture of the North End. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter Huda, 280 South Street. I think this is great, and it's very helpful. The only thing I would ask is you sync up what was on the site and what you have here, because I was trying to follow the corrections that were made, and if you could get them all together and these milestones, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Elizabeth Bratter, 159 McDonough Street, property owner. I wanted to ask about section 10582.1.22, where you change number C. You go there, or you can, so they can all see it.
This
There,
one?
that one there.
Yep.
So in the one that was listed online, it showed that C was changed to more than 25 feet.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Thanks for bringing that up.
So what is it really going to be?
Yeah, what did I do, right? Sorry. The question, if you didn't hear her, was I think the version that might have been distributed had that 50 changed to 25.
Right.
And I noticed when I was going back through this, and I've been going back and forth myself on the 25 versus 50. That's the step back we've talked about ad nauseum here for a shorter building height on a particular street. And I noticed that I didn't address it in A when I looked at it. So the version you've got 50, I think, for A and 25 for C. But the more I thought about it over the last couple of days, I think it's better just to leave it the way it is. I think it's, when you think of the Hill Hanover example that we went through, that little box of taller building would get quite a bit larger if you were only required to be 25 feet back instead of 50 from the so I think it makes sense, given all we've got on our plate here, to leave it at 50. So that's what you'll see in the updated presentation.
Okay. And can you pull up the Hill Hanover Street with the heights?
The example, or
With that, it shows the actual heights there,
Yeah.
because I thought MapGeo showed that Hill Street was at 50.
Yeah, it is
2 to
50.
4 stories, 50 feet.
Hills.
Sorry.
Hill is.
Yeah, it's
Hills
brown.
down.
Yeah, it's brown. If whatever the brown is, let me grab it.
Yeah, Brown is 2 to 4 stories.
Yeah, 2 to 4 stories. Yeah. But
So is Hill Street going to be changed to green? Because that's not what it shows
No.
on this lower map.
correct.
So you
Yes.
just
We
showed
took-
in your other illustration that Hill Street was green and Foundry Place was,
Do you mean the example?
yes.
Okay, let me go to the example. Make
Yeah,
sure we're
When you went to the example, you show.
Right there.
Right there it is. So you show, oh, okay, you
yeah,
showed it as.
no, it's correct. So what we talked about, Liz, and I know you know that, but I did mention that because of Beth's question about whether this is appropriate, especially if we're going to make this brown down here on Foundry Place, which it should be.
It is, yeah.
Whether it's appropriate to continue to have this line be brown through here. And I think it's worth considering, as part of this review, changing that to green.
Correct.
Which would allow a step down for this building, not the one that's grandfathered, but should it come back in a new iteration,
Yeah.
there would be a little more deference given to these buildings, which would certainly threaten them less than this being a taller building. But that's not in front of us, but I think that's worth, through the exercise and the conversation here, evaluating if we're going to make that brown on Foundry Place, maybe we should revisit changing this to green. These are already green here.
Right.
Yep,
And that's the side that's up against the 35-foot buildings.
correct.
The other problem with that location on Foundry and Hill Street is the amount of grade that happens there. It wasn't originally quite that much, but when you dug the hole to put that big old garage in there, that became a very large grade area. It actually goes all the way down to street level, and then it comes up to be 6 or 10 feet. But it's interesting how that grade is perceived by by builders and what they come up with what they can do with that. So that's my concern about the Hill Street side being lower than what you would normally put there. So it's 3 stories, 40 feet, but it could be 2 stories with a third. It's a short third and 35 feet.
So you're talking about changing the green to something, maybe the blue?
I'm talking about changing Hill Street.
Oh, Hill, here.
You could do it on Hanover as well, because then it would match the rest of the neighborhood. If you had a picture of the whole neighborhood, you can see that most of it's GRC, and that is 35 feet. So if you did Hill Street as well as Hanover Street and made it 2 stories with a short third, which would be 35 feet, which would match the rest of the neighborhood. When that was changed, that whole section was changed.
I mean, I think it's worth looking at. And so the options are leave it the way it is, which is 4 stories or 50 feet, the brown.
Yeah, I'm not
Or
considering
that's the current status.
we know that,
Or, yeah, I'm just wanting everybody to be
Be on
clear
the
on
same
what the
page.
choices are moving
Yeah.
forward. Leave it the way it is. We're not proposing to change it. This was just an example of how the multiple building heights work on a lot that's on multiple streets. But it could either be brown, it could be green.
Mm-hmm.
I'd need some time to think about the blue, which is the next step down. I hear
Right.
what you're saying.
It's 5 feet.
This building obviously would be taller than the blue, the triple decker down here. So,
It is,
you know,
yeah.
we need to just, yeah, it's a delicate balance, right?
Right.
To decide what it is you want to protect versus people having the rights to replace things over time and
Well,
what's
and
going
the
to be
thing I
appropriate.
think that's important about this is that that part of Hill Street was all residential.
Understood.
It was zone GRC, and when the Foundry Garage went in, that was changed
Yeah.
to CD5.
Yes, yeah.
So
To
that's the
support a
biggest.
very different neighborhood than has been here for the past 80 years.
Right.
More like the neighborhood that was there prior to 80 years, which
Well, yeah.
was an industrial neighborhood
Industrial,
with big
right.
buildings, yeah.
So those were my 2 things that I noticed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody on Zoom? I think we had one person.
Nope.
Oh, we did earlier.
Person signed up. Thought we should check.
Okay, we've got some reading and thinking to do.
I guess I have one last generic question, Nick.
Yep.
I'm sure this has been thought about before, but do any other cities and towns, instead of having all this conflict with zoning height differences over the same property, do they ever just blot out properties and say this property will be this height? I mean, that might create other problems, but it seems like when you have heights based on lines around streets, you're always going to have these conflicts with some properties having 2 height standards.
Yep. There's no question. It presents a challenge, a design challenge and a permitting challenge, but mainly design, to come up with the right building for a site that has multiple building heights. I will tell you that it's got to be in the high 80s, the percentage of properties that do not suffer that affliction. So we're not dealing with it being a run-of-the-mill situation. And I think probably out of the remaining 10 or 12% that are in the situation of Congress Street, remember, Congress Street and Rains Ave are kind of outliers because they merge lots. You know, so then you've got this added uncertainty of what's going to happen when you start attaching and creating these things when they don't exist when you adopt the code.
Right, yes.
Because Congress Street didn't have Haven Court attached to it before they attached them and merged them. And Rains Ave did the same thing with the Vanguard building being attached, all 3 of those lots. There are 4 different building heights for Rains Ave, and we have to allocate them across that frontage. And it got tricky because the taller building, the Vanguard building, which was brown and 4 stories and 50 feet, plus the ability to go taller, what they're now proposing the hotel to sit on, they were able to bleed that height into the middle building lot, but only 50 feet back from the street. So that's why you have a step down in the building, that effect you guys were talking about. So it's not one size fits all. Most communities do not have a building height map that's based on streets and public places. This is not normal, but that doesn't make it bad. I think it makes it better. It's trickier. It can be more challenging in instances like that, but I think it produces better outcomes, because you don't want to have a building on Sheep Street, having a building as tall as the ones on State Street just because they're on the same lot, bleed its way over. We got one right in front of us now at the Historic District Commission next to the little park, where big additions are being contemplated on the back of the State Street house that has a garage off of Sheaf. So there's no perfect solution. I think this is better than a more global, the whole 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet, whatever it is. I think it works imperfectly, but
Yeah, again, I don't have the answers, but I just wouldn't, I'd prefer a method that wouldn't encourage monopoly, where, it happens in monopoly where you buy all your neighbors' properties and you hope to drag the rules with it. I think that's where you can run into some problems.
And I don't think we're finding that is a significant problem. I know on Rains Ave there was the ability to bump up, but not much, because it's 50 feet back from the street and there's the 100-foot buffer on the back. So the amount of extra space they got by merging those lots was pretty de minimis. And don't forget, if the HDC doesn't like the way that looks, you can call it gaming, legitimately the code. The HDC is under no obligation to approve something that looks odd just because the math worked. So we have to rely, and I think the citizens of the city really need to participate and engage that commission as it does its job if they see something they don't like, as well as something they do like. We don't have a lot of citizen engagement at the Historic Commission. So that to me is a bigger problem than the code.
Nick, I hope this isn't if it's a big question, it's a non-question. The 3D model that you use, is that something that you could show some of these possible massing differences on some of these streets? Is that easy, or is that kind of a big deal?
Well, scenario building is tricky, but what I could do, because I'm not an avid enough user to create my own models, but we at the Historic District Commission, I think the Planning Board, Rick and I have talked about getting the tool in front of you guys as well as the Historic District Commission. When somebody comes in, so we got the same set of projects you guys have at the Planning Board. We got Rains Ave. We see these things for sometimes years before they make it over to the Planning Board. Like 2 Russells on its 8th work session, which is the Sheridan lot. And what we require is when they build their graphics model, they give us the graphics file. We insert it into the 3D model of the city through the Public Works Department and the GIS Department. They take the graphics file, insert it into a scene of buildings that surround the site, and create a computer-generated model that allows us to see at each meeting. We don't do it religiously, and we need to improve on our end, getting those graphics files and getting them into, it's all cloud-based, so you can even look at this on your phone, anybody. Put the link on the webpage. We've fallen a little bit out of practice. We're also a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that's in front of us on the big project end of the scale. But we just did it the other night for 85 Daniel Street, and I could send any of you as an example. We'll post the link for 85 Daniel, which is the house across from the McIntyre that's been purchased, and they're going to put some dormers and a garage off the back of it. We put it in the system, created the scene, and I could pull it up on my phone, and it's a really powerful tool to at least see what you're looking at before you approve it, because you can walk right around the building.
Wow.
So and I apologize. I've not been able to use that as much as we need to and get it to the other boards, but I'll make an effort to do that.
The only other thing I was going to add, Nick, on the GIS front is, as someone who is slightly colorblind, sometimes the colors on Map Geo.
Oh, they're terrible.
I struggle with, and so
Yeah.
I always have to have the legend right there.
I
So
hear you, and they're too thin. You
If
know.
there's, I don't know, if there's a way to either label the lines or something along those lines,
Yeah, I'll talk to Jamie.
just be helpful when you're like, you know, out in no man's land on the map, and you're like, wait a second, I can have the legend figure this out.
I think line weight is the way to address it, but you know.
Oh, that'd be fine by me, all black and white.
If you're taking general suggestions.
Yes.
On the zoning maps themselves, I
Yep.
think some of them, like, there's 3 maps on an.
On one
8.5
page.
by 11.
Yep.
It's like, wow. I mean, you can't, you can't decipher it, so if you could blow.
I mean, we plot those, and can you not zoom in when you're looking at it electronically? I mean, we've got wall-size printouts of those same maps. So they're PDFs, and you should be able to.
Well, I'm just thinking, as you scroll through, I don't see a reason why you have to have so many zoning maps on one document. I don't know why they can't be separated into different pages.
We could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the building height, the character districts, the regulating plan, and the frontage map. Those are all on one sheet.
Oh, yeah,
And they aren't easy to read. If you're doing it electronically, you have to zoom in and out. So it's a point well taken.
Okay, I think we are done. Shall we have a motion to adjourn?
So, or we could just end.
We can just end. We can just end.
Just walk away.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.